Thank you very much, everybody. I think I would like to start, first of all, by thanking some people. And can I thank, of course, HMEP and the Department for Transport for funding this new guidance, which I hope you will find helpful and actually a very good document to support you in what you're trying to do with managing highway maintenance. I would also like to thank CHT for organizing this event today and giving us the opportunity to talk to all of you here. What are we going to talk about today? I'm afraid this is the longest presentation of the afternoon. The other two presentations to follow are more practical and they're shorter as well, so please bear with us. This presentation will focus very much on what this guidance is. The new Highway Infrastructure Asset Management Guidance, which is available on the website, on the UKRLG website as of now. We're going to talk a little bit about the framework of asset management, the new idea that has been developed and introduced through this guidance. Talk a bit about the advice that is given in the new guidance document, but focus really on the recommendations and the implementation. So it's great, we've got a new guidance document, what do we do with it next? The need for new guidance, well actually Matthew in his presentation very well explained some of the background about why did we think we needed a new guidance, but I thought it might be worth giving you our view about why the new guidance was needed. Well, we have going the distance, talking about affordability and the standards we said. We had the potholes review talking about prevention and a better cure, how plant maintenance can help us prevent the problem rather than try to cure it. I'll go a little bit further back. We had the review of Tachtsi a few years back that told us that asset management is great. A lot of authorities are doing a lot of good work in asset management, but we are not sure about what it really means. We're not sure about how to implement it. We don't have the resources, and I will put in brackets next to resources. We don't always have the skills, and we don't have the buy-in from senior officers in the organizations to persevere with asset management. And what became important, what became obvious, was that there is very progress on asset management. Some authorities are doing a brilliant job on an element of asset management, other practitioners do a brilliant job on another part of asset management, but there are few examples of organizations that run asset management through and through, properly, the way we describe asset management in this new guidance. Also, there are many documents, some of which Matthew listed earlier, and there's PAS 55 and the new ISO, the forthcoming ISO, it will be available hopefully next year. All these things are happening around us, but we needed one single document to help us move on. And again, the publication slide that Matthew just finished on, but just to remind you, there are lots of things out there already, so we're not starting from scratch. We're recognizing good work has been done. Let's move on now, based on our experience. Important to note that this guidance wasn't developed by a project team in isolation, as we've said many times in the slide. So this is an HMEP product, and it has been supported by technical group. The technical group was very much focused around the requirements of UKRLG, the UK Roads Liaison Group. And we had a technical group that didn't look at project management issues. The technical group really represented the sector and brought us their experience, their knowledge, their understanding, their examples of good practice to lead the guidance was pragmatic and it is applicable for what practitioners want to achieve. We ran a number of consultation workshops, 2 formal workshops funded by HMEP in the summer, where we had invited attendees who came and gave us their views about where the guidance was going. But we also had a number of informal workshops through working groups, regional working groups, national working groups, the SIPFA Highways Asset Management Planning Network. We also had significant contributions from the UK Roads Liaison Group, even though they joined the working group later on. However, they have been contributing through their representatives in the working group from the start of the project. And of course, we had input from the HMEP project and program boards, and we had the support from the HMEP Design Assurance Group. So I hope I'm demonstrating, plus a number of emails and unofficial communication with people. I hope we're demonstrating this is enough in starting a guidance. This is really led by the sector. Scope and target audience. Well, what we wanted to produce was a document that will help the industry move forward. We wanted to introduce a step change. This was the opportunity to learn from lessons so far, build on existing experience, and produce something new, something proactive, something that will move the industry forward. The guidance replaces all the other guidance documents that I showed you earlier on asset management, so the CSS framework, the Quick Start guidance brings all of those together. It does support the requirements of PAS 55 and the new ISO. It does introduce a step change in the industry. I keep saying that. It covers all assets, so it's not just carriageway focused. It very much covers everything on the highway asset, bridges, lighting, the hot stock. It's also developed in a way that we hope will be useful to all types of authorities, smaller authorities, larger county councils, and it will also have something for everybody, for those who make good progress and can demonstrate good practice, but also those who are at an early stage of their asset management journey, if you like. So hopefully something in there for all. Target audience, well actually there are three key groups of people that we're targeting with that. First of all, senior decision makers, and that includes the senior officers as well as the elected members, the people with decision-making powers in organizations. We're also targeting asset managers themselves, the people who have the responsibility for implementing asset management in authorities, as well as practitioners at all levels in the organization. And I hope you will find from the guidance that the language changes throughout the different sections, the different parts of the guidance. It goes from high level down to practitioner level to people in the front line. Advice is given in the guidance on how to apply the principles of asset management. We're not reinventing asset management. The principles are well established, well documented, well tested. This document, this guidance tells you how to apply these principles in the local authority, highway local authority environment. And just to remind you something that you should be familiar with, the UK Roads Liaison Group hierarchy of guidance documents. We've often used this hierarchy. It is actually published currently in the codes of practice and demonstrates how government policy right at the top translates all the way down to the practical codes of practice, to the four codes of practice that you should be very well familiar with. And the highway infrastructure asset management is the last orange box right in the middle. This is the document that we're talking about today, which of course links with the SIPA and highway infrastructure assets code of practice. The structure of the document, well, it's not a very long document. The main text is just under 100 pages, and if you include the appendices, it's about 130 pages, so it's not a very long document. But it comes in three different parts. Of course, we've got the introduction, the executive summary, straightforward, but it comes in three different parts. The first part is something that's relatively new. That's something that wasn't there before. It focuses very much on the context of asset management. It talks about why we needed this new guidance and why we need to apply asset management. The second part is the asset management planning process, and the last part is the enablers. So we try to focus on the different elements of the organization and what is needed for the different parts of the organization. Alan is going to go later in a minute. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about what the different parts include. The guidance includes 14 recommendations, so it's not a very large number of recommendations. And again, in a few minutes, you will see a little bit more detail about how these recommendations and how they should be applied. But the recommendations, hopefully, will help you to understand how to apply the principles of asset management. And here is a summary of the recommendation. Now, the next few slides will take you through the recommendations one by one and give you a few examples of what is happening. And I'll pass over to Alan at this point, I think, who is going to introduce the framework and the recommendations of the guidance. And I've got a little also for this.
Okay, good afternoon everyone, thank you. So, Lena's given you the introduction of set the scene for where we are with the guidance. What I'm going to talk about is the recommendations in the guidance and talk about the framework itself. I think perhaps the first point to emphasise is that this is a guidance document and recommendations aren't mandatory, and it's probably just worth making the point that there are other documents out there such as PAS 55 and the forthcoming ISO 55000. These are standards. This document is not standard, but it is aimed at the highway sector and is aimed at delivering efficiencies and better practice across the sector. The recommendations themselves, which I'll go into detail now, very much describe the minimum requirements for highway authorities, and I think it's really important to emphasise when we say minimum requirements, and the recommendations themselves should be taken as a whole and not individually. There'll be many authorities out there who perhaps exceeded the expectations of recommendations. One of the things that the guidance touches on is also a maturity framework for assessing progress against those recommendations. But the first recommendation within the guidance is here for you to see, so I won't read it out, but it's really about local highway authorities adopting a framework for highway asset management. And that framework is presented in the guidance, and Leela's already explained about the three parts of the framework. But firstly, it's about setting asset management in context. You know, those are what local authorities have to face in terms of delivery, in terms of government requirements, in terms of local requirements, in terms of corporate vision. It describes an asset management planning process, which many of you will be familiar with, but also associated with that is what we call asset management enablers, or the activities in asset management that require to support the planning process. And I think in the past, there perhaps hasn't been enough evidence or enough description in terms of what these activities are, and the new guidance really brings these into play. In addition to that, there's two other activities which hopefully you can read at the bottom there, which are about programme and service delivery and procurement. Now, the guidance doesn't talk about those two activities, but very much links into other HMEP products. But I think I make the point now, and perhaps a very important point, that really the asset management process is really the enabling process for procurement and for service delivery. So those organisations who are looking at procurement service delivery, getting their asset management processes right and approach right in the first place will create or enable greater efficiencies. So looking at part A, the context, this is really the local authority environment in which authorities have to deliver asset management. There's government requirements such as national transport policy, local transport policy for most authorities, whether a corporate vision document, and perhaps foremost in most people's mind is really about financial constraints. You know, the authority at corporate level will set budgets and so forth and provide a constraint really in what authorities can do. In terms of doing that, that very much sets the scene for how local authorities have to deliver asset management. The guidance itself describes some of those activities, so, which many of you will be familiar with, but very much also ties into how well-maintained highways present those as well. So in terms of that, so once the scene has been set, the next aspect is really establishing communications. Now, in the previous guidance, and many of you will be familiar with that, the customer is really very much the centre of that in terms of delivering customer expectations through an asset management planning process, and again, many of you will be familiar with that. This guidance doesn't really present that in a different way. The customer, road user requirements and public expectations and other stakeholder requirements are still at the centre of delivering asset management. But in reality, the guidance moves it on a little bit in terms of recognising there's a financial constraint around all of that, and stakeholders and the public can't always have what they want. The key aspect in all of that is about better communication, and also about two-way communication process, making sure that actually if an authority can only deliver a certain amount, that certain amount is actually clearly communicated, that stakeholders are consulted, but expectations are very much managed in that whole process. So communications is very much the aspect that links, let's say, the context of asset management in terms of delivering those requirements with the asset management planning process. So getting that right in the first place is an important enabler to actually starting the asset management process for real. So that's part A of the guidance with those two recommendations. Moving on to part B, which is the asset management planning process, which again, the general planning process, many of you will be familiar with. In the previous asset management guidance it was also discussed. However, in this guidance, what we've done is we've put more emphasis around policy, strategy and performance. So key aspects there, but very much related to what senior decision makers have to do within the process of asset management to establish how it's going to be delivered. So part B, and I'll explain in a minute, starts off very much setting the scene for policy and about setting a strategy and the importance of that in terms of driving the direction of the organisation in terms of asset management. One of the areas that Part B does not make a recommendation, and again it's an important part, it does not make a recommendation about highway asset management plan. And again, if you go back to the previous guidance, if you go back to the DFT setting TAMPs in place and so forth, transport asset management plans have been quite an important deliverable for asset management over the last 5 years. The point about not having the asset management plan as a recommendation is really about giving authorities flexibility to use documentation and supporting the asset management process as they see fit. The guidance itself discusses the asset management plan, but doesn't make a recommendation around it, so it's very much flexible in that regard, and it's up to authorities how they wish to adopt that. So moving on to asset management policy and strategy, there's a very strong recommendation in the guidance about authorities setting a policy and strategy that is published, that is communicated to stakeholders, that describes how the corporate vision is going to be achieved through managing the network. In that, the first aspect is delivering the policy, and making that policy is really a 2-page document that's visible to all stakeholders, all people in the authority and all service providers. It's making clear statement of intent from leadership within the authority, how they're going to adopt the principles of asset management and the commitment towards asset management. If you think about it, it's very similar to what you might see in terms of health and safety policy or other policies you might see around your organisation. But it's really something that perhaps you put up in the staff canteen or whatever, but really sets where asset management is, but also, most importantly, sets the commitment from senior decision makers around asset management. And again, that's an important part of this guidance, that actually senior decision makers and commitment are really key to actually delivering asset management, quite obviously. The asset management strategy itself is about taking that corporate vision and translating into a series of outcomes for a network. Previously, there's a lot of focus on delivering an asset management plan, which experience tells us could range from 20 to 30 pages to 500 pages. And that really wasn't a document that could be digested or communicated to senior decision makers. So the asset management strategy is all about short documents that sets out very clearly how the outcomes around asset management, around maintenance, are going to be delivered within the organisation. So it's something that has to be developed with senior decision makers, but sets the direction very clearly. There's an example, and there's an example in the appendix in the guidance of what an asset management policy looks like. That is Hampshire's policy, and we've got Hampshire here today. So thank you very much, Hampshire. So once the strategy has been developed, and once the outcomes and the direction have been identified, key aspect is how do we measure performance around that. And what the guidance introduces is what we call a performance management framework. I think authorities, once they set the strategy, need to be clear that that strategy is achievable. And if we go back to what Going the Distance says very much about service standards that can be afforded, such as Matthew mentioned earlier, you need a performance management framework around that to actually measure what you're doing. So this guidance very much introduces that. And there's a number of aspects, a number of inputs into that performance management framework, which, for example, include the asset management strategy, but most importantly include budgets, include stakeholder expectations, and also we mustn't forget what we call engineering integrity. Some of the things actually hold the fabric and network together. So those are inputs into the performance management framework, but from that, through the process of identifying levels of service, performance measures, and then performance targets, we can set out a vision for how that network is going to look in the short, medium, and longer term. And that vision itself should support or underpin the strategy. Again, one of the challenges in terms of delivering the guidance was very much around levels of service. This concept of levels of service is something that's very much been introduced and interpreted around highways. If we look at PAS 55, PAS 55 talks about objectives and not levels of service. So certainly in the steering group there's some discussion around the terminology we should use, but nonetheless we stuck with levels of service that's well understood by the industry. It's about getting those broad statements correct to support your strategy, and through that measuring it with a number of performance measures and targets. And most importantly, those targets have to be realistic. I'll discuss in a minute how we actually measure those targets. But really, up to that point, in policy, strategy, and performance management framework, there's a strong element of senior decision input into that. It's very much up to senior decision makers to support you as asset management engineers to deliver that framework, but it needs that commitment. Performance management framework needs to be developed, but it's actually achievable. And senior decision makers need to sign up to that. Once that framework and strategy has been set out, then we can look at asset management data. And I think in many places, or traditionally to use those words, asset management data has been very much the starting point for asset management. It's what data I got and then what can I do with the data in terms of delivering my lifecycle plans, my forward programs, and so forth. I think a key point in the guidance is that the data needs to support your strategy and needs to support the performance management framework. And maybe that's a subtle difference from the approach that's been adopted before. But the key point is that if you've got data that doesn't support a strategy, that doesn't support the performance management framework, then actually it's not a lot of use to you, and why are you collecting it? So I'm not going to talk too much about data, but to make the key point, the data has to support strategy and performance management framework. The document itself also makes a recommendation that you can read there, but also talks particularly about how data can be used. And I think another important point to emphasise is that good data, accurate data, reliable data supports good asset management. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But what the guidance doesn't do is it doesn't promote an approach where you have to go out and spend lots and lots of money on collecting data. Quite reasonably, that isn't practical today. What it supports is an approach where you can develop a data strategy and look at how you can make better use of the data that you do have. And also, if you haven't got sufficient data, how you can manage the risk associated with that data. And I think that's the important emphasis that the data section within the guidance has. So it doesn't need a lot of data to do asset management, but if you don't have a lot of data, understand the risks associated with that and manage them appropriately. So obviously data supports lifecycle planning to various extents. Lifecycle planning, of course HMEP have already launched a product on that, which Atkins have been involved in. But again, adopting lifecycle principles is really the fundamental starting point for developing investment strategies in the network. So you have your data, you have your strategy, now you can start developing maintenance strategies to understand how you can best invest your money in the network. And lifecycle planning principles will deliver those aspirations. The guidance itself talks about lifecycle planning, links into the other HMEP products, but also introduces some decision-making techniques around lifecycle planning as well that can be used. And again, many of you will be familiar with these, but we introduce risk as a decision-making technique. We also introduce obviously whole life costing as a decision-making technique, and also identifying the economic benefits around that, the potential for doing that, and also a multi-criteria analysis as a decision-making technique, which again many of you may be familiar with the term value engineering or value management. But it introduces a new lifecycle planning process that's been adopted. It adopts the same terminology for data as a SIP for guidance. It sets out the approach for what is required for the lifecycle planning process, and then how that data and information is actually used to develop a maintenance strategy. And from the maintenance strategy, run various scenarios depending on your decision-making process, which will eventually deliver investment strategies. And the two basic approaches it sets out for investment strategies are really, for example, budget constraints. If I only have so much budget, what can I do with it? And secondly, if I have this amount of budget, what performance can I deliver out of the network? So it very much answers those two questions that many authorities may have within that overall process. Obviously, Matthew mentioned earlier about the HMEP Lifecycle Toolkit. For those of you who aren't aware, it's available at that web link to be downloaded. But it's a relatively simple, easy-to-use spreadsheet for lifecycle planning that, again, can be adopted, and it's a very flexible tool that, again, can be used across a variety of assets to do lifecycle planning. And the guidance very much links in with that. So once you set your lifecycle planning process, what you should have done is really set your budgets, hopefully the short, medium, and long term. So once you have your budgets in place, then you can start looking at your work programs, hopefully over a 3 to 5 year period. And what the guidance does say is that authorities should look at a prioritised forward works program, and it introduces the concept of a rolling period of 3 to 5 years for doing that. That's introducing some flexibility within works programming. It sets out a process here that again introduces new terminology that we might not have seen before, introduces the terminology of candidate schemes. Either those schemes have been identified for the forward works program, they still have to go through a process of prioritisation before they actually go into the final program. It also introduces the concept of optimisation as well, because once you do have those listed schemes, ideally what you want to try and do is optimise those schemes and try and maximise the potential for them to deliver what you want them to deliver. So the guidance makes a recommendation in this regard and introduces a series of concepts around works programming. And I think the final point to make on works programming is it is the final outcome of the asset management planning process, those works in the ground. Just going back to what I said earlier, what the guidance doesn't do is make a recommendation about the highway asset management plan. But what it does suggest you do is you gather together a series of documentation, including what I've discussed, and actually update that regularly. You can put that into a plan, or you can maintain it separately. The flexibility is up to you. So, but part C, or the enablers, or the aspects that actually support the asset management planning process, and I think it's important to recognise that once you go through that process I've just described in part B, there's a series of enablers that need to support you to get there. Making the case for investment, competency and skills, risk management, asset management systems, benchmarking, and also an implementation plan for how you can deal with asset management. All these are aspects that are going to support the implementation of asset management. And I'll talk about these and the recommendations in a bit more detail now. So the starting point for supporting the asset management process is around leadership and commitment from elected members and senior decision makers. Without that support, then implementing asset management, there's every possibility you may be up against it. I think it's also important to reflect on leadership commitment in terms of where the new ISO 55000 is going. It's also the foremost of ISO 55000. So it's widely recognised in the industry that actually leadership commitment itself is a key enabler for asset management. So I think senior decision makers have a role to demonstrate leadership to enable the implementation of asset management. And around that, there are key issues surrounding culture. There's key issues surrounding actually how do you make the case for investment in asset management. And finally, some discussion really around the economic benefits of asset management, which again is a key challenge. And still where we are today, there's no systematic approach that we can adopt for demonstrating the economic benefits of highway maintenance. There's a recommendation around making a case for asset management and about implementing the asset management framework. In making the case, the asset management guidance can very much be used for you to take to senior decision makers to say, well, if you gave me so much more money, I could give you so much more performance out of the network. There's a business case to underpin that, and many authorities at the moment already go through potential borrowing and other means of funding. But the document itself very much describes how you can make the case for asset management in the first place, and how you can enable additional funding if that is the route you want to go down. But also it emphasises that obviously that's not the only route to go down. So in doing that, organisational considerations are important. Also key roles within an organisation in implementing asset management. Just recognises some key roles around that. And perhaps most importantly in all of that, it's about skills and competency within the organisation. And again, there's a recommendation around skills and competency. Matthew explained earlier as well, there's a training package that will support this guidance as well around skills and competency, and I think it's an important part for successful implementation. So recommendation around risk management, and I think a key point to emphasise is that the way that risk management is presented in the guidance is that risk management very much supports asset management. And I think for those authorities undertaking asset management, the guidance doesn't promote a separate thinking around risk and separate thinking around asset management. The two are inherently linked. Risk management very much supports asset management. Risk management itself is described in separate ISOs and separate risk management policies and so forth. But setting that aside, it is an important enabler for the decision-making process all the way from do I undertake inspections, what data do I need, all the way to those decisions about what schemes you do in the network and what mitigation actions are actually in place. So the guidance very much introduces that concept of risk management, and probably for the first time in terms of UKRG suite of guidance documents, actually very much introduces a key enabler for asset management. And particularly in today's environment where all authorities, central government is financially constrained, how risk is managed is really a key topic. It introduces a process for risk management, which again, those who understand risk will probably be familiar with. But again, it's about establishing a process for risk management and documenting that process for risk management as part of the asset management process. Yes, the outcomes are things like risk registers, identifying likelihood of risks, identifying consequences and so forth, and putting a risk action plan into place. but then it's how that links into your forward program works at the end of the day as well as an important aspect. The guidance document talks about asset management systems, and I think the first point to emphasise about asset management systems is asset management is not about having a system and then using the system to manage the asset. The asset management system is an enabler for asset management, so it has to be appropriate, it has to be proportional, and also has to be sustainable. And the guidance very much introduces these concepts because depending on how and to what level you practice asset management, then your asset management system has to be proportional to that. So there's no point in investing significant amounts of money in asset management systems and not having the data to support it, and not having the knowledge or competency skills in the organisation to manage it. So some key considerations that the guidance introduces about how asset management systems should be set up and actually how they should be funded, and also how the case for asset management systems should be made. It also introduces a diagram of what an asset management system comprises and introduces some discussion around decision-making techniques. But the recommendation is really all about systems that are sustainable and accessible. Okay. The key point is it's to support asset management, and they're not there to dictate asset management. And again, there's a subtle difference, but it's very important. Those systems support what you're doing, don't tell you what you're doing. So issues to consider are things like functionalities of the system, identifying requirements, making a business case for asset management systems, and that's described in detail there. Training and competency is important. Total cost of ownership and actually the process for procurement of those systems, obviously updating and upgrading those systems, and how local authority IT departments are involved. So all those issues are covered in the guidance. So moving on from that, when I introduced the concept of performance management framework, very much talked about the setting, how the outcomes of the asset management strategy are going to be measured in the short, medium and longer term. The concept of performance management, or sorry, performance monitoring, is all about the process of measuring those outcomes and how it's done. The key issues are information and data arising from implementation and delivery of asset management. Also implementing and maintaining processes to monitor performance and approaches to asset management. Key aspect of all of that is performance reviews, and the guidance itself talks quite a bit about performance reviews, management reviews. There's many names that can be adopted for them. But essentially it's re-engagement with senior decision makers to actually determine whether the outcomes from the asset management strategy are being met, and if they're not being met, really what needs to be done to overcome that. And actually also review whether the strategy in the first place was realistic. But performance monitoring itself is a very important part of the continuous improvement cycle, an important part of asset management. The concept of benchmarking, again, well understood by many authorities already, but the guidance re-emphasises the need for benchmarking to measure performance against your neighbours, against similar authorities, however you might view it. But actually the point of measuring that performance is really to learn lessons around performance monitoring, around continuous improvement and so forth, and to share those lessons. So quite rightly the guidance makes a recommendation around benchmarking and how that should be used to improve continuous improvement. So that's a quick overview of the recommendations of the guidance. As part of a double act, I'm going to hand back to Leila, who's going to take you through to the end of the presentation.
Right, okay, towards the end now of the longest of the presentations. I'll emphasize again a point that Alan made earlier, that the recommendations should be considered on their entirety. You can't pick and choose. You can't say I will have good enablers, but I will not bother with policy and strategy. On the other hand, you can't say I will develop a fantastic policy and asset management strategy, but I will not bother collecting any data or putting them in a proper asset register. So you must really take the time to pick up the guidance, look at the recommendations, every single one of them, and see how you match against them. I think it's very important if we want to make progress. If we do want to introduce this step change, we must look at asset management as a whole. That's exactly what FAS 55 says. That's what the forthcoming ISO is going to do. But another new idea in this guidance is the fact that actually we need to be able to identify who has responsibility for each element of the asset management framework. We've got the concept of the framework now. We recognize Part A, Part B, and Part C, the context, the planning process, and the enablers. Who has responsibility for each one of these parts? Who has responsibility for the organization for the strategic, tactical, and operational levels of asset management? This diagram is there to replace the old triangle. I'm sure all of you will be familiar with the old triangle of strategic, tactical, and operational. What we're trying to do here is actually demonstrate what are the activities under each one of these levels. And if you look at the box that is at the end of the graph, you can see very clearly what are the actions at the strategic level. What are the responsibilities of the senior decision makers? They must be able to not only understand what the asset management framework is telling them, but actually they should be in a position to endorse it. They should be able to endorse, again, set and endorse the asset management policy and strategy. They should be able to support officers in the work they are doing to align the organization's corporate objectives with the levels of service in the performance management framework. They should be able to work with you and agree performance targets. You can't set performance targets on your own. Nobody in the organization can do that in isolation. You should work with senior decision makers to set performance targets. And of course, set the context for managing this. People cannot do that again in isolation. They need to do it within the organizational context. The asset management staff, the people who very often have the title of asset manager, they should carry the responsibility for implementing the asset management framework that has been endorsed by the senior decision makers. And they should be able to provide the information through the tools and the enablers to provide the information that is needed to make some of these key decisions. And finally, the operational staff, the people who will be responsible for delivering the program of works. And they should also be responsible for providing the information that is needed for measuring performance, monitoring performance. So we've seen the guidance, the overview of the guidance, we've seen the recommendations and summary of the recommendations, but we wanted to demonstrate that these recommendations are pragmatic. They can be delivered, they can make a difference. So the guidance includes a number of case studies, and the case studies are real case studies, talking about what various people have done around the UK, and what are the benefits that they saw from the work they did on asset management. I will just pick a couple of examples. We've already seen the asset management as policy from Hampshire. There's we can study about the strategy as well. I pick the people who I can see in the room. There's something on works program from Cornwall, and we'll hear a bit more about it from Andy in a little bit, particularly around asset management. There's a case study I can see among the above. So there is a case study about how to manage data management, how to make decisions about registers and so on. Society has given us a good case study on that. There's some work from Brighton University about training and skills, again a program that is supported by HMEP. So there are a number of, and Westminster, of course, talking about risk management and what we are doing in terms of optimizing the way we manage risk. So lots of case studies, pragmatic things, things that practitioners have already benefited from. So please do take the time to look at the case studies. And just to emphasize that actually, if you want to follow up the case studies, at the back of the appendix, there are links with names and email addresses. If you want to find more information, people will be very happy to help you. So that's where we are. We've got the guidance. What do we do with it? Well, there's a chapter, the very last chapter in the guidance says getting started. And actually Mike is sitting on the front. Mike was very keen to say getting started and progressing, recognizing that some people have already made good progress on asset management. So very simple, the old trick of gap analysis. Do carry out a review of where you currently are and compare that with what you would consider to be desired practice. The recommendations of this guidance, examples of good practice from the case studies, are ideas about what your desired practice should be. But the key point there, you have to establish this desired practice in agreement with your senior decision makers, so you know exactly what you're going to be doing. As a result of the gap analysis, the outcome will be an implementation plan. Identify the strong areas, the areas of strength, the areas of good practice in your organization, as well as the areas where you need to focus on introducing some improvements. And that implementation plan should steer you through improving asset management practices. And just one more slide to just take you through the steps from carrying out the gap analysis all the way down to monitoring performance and review progress. And yes, the guidance does exist. It's on the website that you can see on your screens, and that's out there. So hopefully you'll all go back to your offices today or tomorrow morning. You download it and read it in your own time. As I said, very well written, and not a very long text. A very easy document to read, in my opinion. The two letters have your papers. To remind you that there will be another document coming out very soon. It will be well, actually it's 3 pages at the moment, but hopefully it will be 4 pages once we do the front cover. A brief leaflet in A5 format that you can print off the internet to give to your senior decision makers and engage in conversation with you. I kept saying earlier, and Alan kept saying, that you need the support from your senior decision makers, but we do understand that sometimes starting these conversations are not easy. So this leaflet should provide the starting point to go and talk to some of the people who want to hear about why is asset management important, why should they invest their limited resources on developing asset management framework and not on something else, why investment in highway maintenance is important, how you're going to make the case. And it's not in the room, but as I said, the guidance was live this morning, and this is the front page of the UK Water Group website where you're going to find the guidance if you follow the link. So enjoy the reading. I started my presentation with thank you, and I will finish with some more thanks. Thank you very much to the working group. We had challenging working group. Every step has been challenged. Every word in this guidance has been discussed in the working group to make sure we really do reflect on good practice, on the experience and the lessons we've learned from implementing asset management so far. So thank you very much to everybody in the working group. Thank you very much to everybody who has provided case studies, and I will be here today, so thanks for that. Thank you very much to the project team who did bear with us during the revision. It was revision 11 that were published in there, so you can see what we have gone through. It has been a challenging project. And thank you very much to all of you who attended here today to hear about the launch of the asset management guidance. And finally, thank you to the people who bear with the webinar and they take the time to listen to that. That's it. That's our email addresses. Please take the time to ask questions if you have any.